Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm glad to see all of you who could make it out here today despite the weather. I'd like to begin by thanking all the people behind the scenes who help make events like this possible. For the wonderful folks in events management and information technology who we so often take for granted, how about a round of applause? Okay. Before we begin, you should be aware that this presentation is being recorded and may be posted online in case you were thinking of asking a question or hurling invectives at me. But let's get to it. What would Martin Luther King Jr. think of today's critical race theory? I think that's a pretty interesting question and one worth exploring as we seek to better understand Dr. King's legacy in our country and the current direction of race relations in America. In posing a question like this, however, there are some real problems to be faced. First, there's always a danger in speculating about what an historical figure would think about a contemporary situation. More often than not, you get the opinion of the speculator foisted on the historical person. I hope I can avoid this. In that direction, I'll be supporting my claims with evidence from King's own words. However, if you think I have anything wrong, if you think I have misrepresented him or critical race theory, I welcome your disagreement and challenges during the Q&A period, and we can talk about it. Second, we hardly have consensus about what critical race theory even is. The whole thing can be pretty amorphous. How we define critical race theory requires some time here then at the beginning, but I'm going to try not to drone on too long about it. First, let's be clear about what critical race theory is not. There are plenty of people on both sides of the CRT divide who are not being helpful in how they describe it. Critical race theory is not teaching white children that they're all evil, colorless, racist oppressors. And critical race theory is also not just teaching the facts of history. Critical race theory is teaching an interpretation of historical and contemporary events, and many of its claims are bold and controversial. It's not coming out of hatred for white folks, but it is provocative and contentious. Here's a definition of CRT that I think is pretty good. It comes from Prudence Carter, a sociology professor at Berkeley. She says, critical race theory is a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals mistreating each other. There are actual structures in our society that create these kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. They actually show us how laws that are supposed to be neutral can actually promulgate or support racial disparities. One other thing to note before we jump into the meat and potatoes of the issue. There's often confusion about how we differentiate critical race theory in the 1980s or 90s and what is called critical race theory today. In the words of Adam Kirsch, poet and literary critic, in the life of any big idea, there comes a moment when it stops belonging to the thinkers who invented it and becomes public property. Today, critical race theory is undergoing that kind of transformation. It is true that CRT has its foundation in the work of people like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's also true that there are people today calling any woke statement on race CRT. However, let us be clear. The ideology of critical race theory is not limited to its early work, even if people overstate its presence today. CRT has evolved and taken on new spokespeople. And so we're not limited to discussing its founding figures alone. In this respect, I think it's like postmodernism. Postmodernism had its start with figures like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. However, it developed from there. And we can point to authentic postmodernism over the past decades without reference to these earlier figures. Also, in a way similar to postmodernism, CRT began as a purely academic discipline before becoming more mainstream and eventually influencing culture in significant ways. So I think it makes sense to talk about people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo as contemporary voices of critical race theory, even if they object sometimes. With that in mind, we turn to our central question. What would Dr. King think of critical race theory? If you were expecting an absolute answer, imagining King either in full support or complete opposition to CRT, you should have known better. To begin with, King was a nuanced thinker, not an ideologue. He was adept at being able to articulate what he liked and what he didn't like about a particular philosophy or ideology. Moreover, there isn't a single critical race theory with a formal creed that you can either accept or reject. Critical race theorists make a variety of claims, some of which nearly all of you would agree with, and others that most of you would find hard to swallow. So rather than a singular answer, I think it's best to identify where MLK would find himself in agreement with CRT and where he would object. To do this, I'll be presenting 9 ideas found in critical race theory and then arguing what I believe would be Dr. King's response to those ideas. So, number 1, insofar as critical race theory teaches that justice demands that we look beyond individual acts of racism to the residual and structural effects of prior racist acts, King would agree. This is one of the central claims of CRT. Racial injustice involves more than overt acts of racial discrimination. There is more involved than bigoted behavior, legal or otherwise, of racists. There is what many today call systemic racism or structural racism. Now, some people don't like to call this racism, and fair enough, but CRT folks point to legacies of earlier racism, whether in law, policies, or institutions, that continue unjust racial inequity. And King would agree that this is something that we need to both acknowledge and address. First, as with our better discussions of privilege, people should be aware that discrimination in the past has created ongoing challenges for people today. King wrote, "This is the Negro's dilemma. He who starts behind in a race must forever remain behind or run faster than the man in front." Recognizing this is important. Today, there are people talking about the effects of things like redlining and poor schooling. King was particularly concerned about the latter. He wrote, "Whatever pathology may exist in Negro families is far exceeded by this social pathology in the school system that refuses to accept a responsibility that no one else can bear and then scapegoats Negro families for failing to do the job." People today raise concerns about problems in Black American families. For example, the number of children raised without a father in the home. The institution of the Black American family is one of the things that King wanted to address. He wrote, "Today there is considerable discussion about the disintegration of the Negro family in the urban ghettos. The shattering blows on the Negro family have made it fragile, deprived, and often psychopathic. This is doubly tragic because nothing is so much needed as a secure family life for a people seeking to rise out of poverty and backwardness. But this institution has been corrupted by previous acts of racial injustice." King argued that the legacy of slave owners tearing apart Black families had an ongoing impact all the way until his own day. Understanding and addressing racial injustice in America requires recognizing the historical effects of racist actions, laws, and policies in the past. And it's not enough to simply acknowledge these historical legacies. Sometimes there are things that we need to fix today. As both CRT folks and King would argue, it's a lot easier to simply fight against acts of bigotry than to transform a society. He wrote, "White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination. When Negroes looked for the second phase, the realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared. But the absence of brutality and unregenerate evil is not the presence of justice." Of course, what is much more important than pointing at a problem is doing something about it, to which we will return later. Second point, insofar as critical race theory teaches that America is essentially a white supremacist state, I believe King would disagree. CRT has a well-earned reputation for increasingly bold language regarding the current state of race relations in America. It seems that the standard for what qualifies as racist or white supremacy is lowered daily. We live, according to Kimberly Crenshaw, in a regime of uncontested white supremacy, or, according to Anastasia Higginbotham, children's author and CRT advocate, any place where there are white people has violent white supremacy embedded into it. More than a negative portrayal of the current reality, a picture is painted of our future that also looks bleak and nearly hopeless. Robin DiAngelo writes, "A positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy." And I believe this is similar to the views of Derek Bell himself, as we find in his book, Faces at the Bottom of Well, The Permanence of Racism. I think it's fair to say that King would have rejected this cynicism and gloom. First of all, unlike many of these writers, King firmly believed in the American project. He recognized that our country has very often and in terrible ways failed to live up to its ideals, but the ideals were good. He could write about his great love for the Constitution of the US, and he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, saying, "I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind." He could recognize the failings of our founding fathers while celebrating the tremendous contributions they made to human civilization. He wrote, "There is much in the life of Jefferson that can serve as a model for political leaders in every age. He came close to the ideal philosopher king that Plato dreamed of centuries ago. But in spite of this, Jefferson was a child of his culture who had been influenced by the pseudoscientific and philosophical thought that rationalized slavery." And King could clearly see progress where it had been made. Yes, even during the 1950s and 60s. In the midst of those years of struggle, he could chastise those who could only see what was wrong. He complained about those people, writing, focusing on the ultimate goal and discovering it's still distant, they declare no progress at all has been made. And more than avoiding cynicism, he understood very clearly what happens when hope is taken from people and despondency is all that's left to peddle. He saw this during his own time with the Black Power movement. He wrote, "The Black Power movement rejected the one thing that keeps the fire of revolutions burning, the ever-present flame of hope. When hope dies, a revolution degenerates into an undiscriminating catch-all for evanescent and futile gestures. The Negro cannot entrust his destiny to a philosophy nourished solely on despair, to a slogan that cannot be implemented into a program." And of course, this was not some naive, idyllic view of what was going on. He could say, the American people are infected with racism. That is their peril. Paradoxically, they are also infected with democratic ideals. That is the hope. While doing wrong, they have the potential to do right. There was, he believed, good reason for his dream. I think it's also important to point out that in seeing the struggles of Black folks, he believed many of the problems were about poverty, not race. Regarding the riots in Los Angeles, he wrote, "I would minimize the racial significance and point to the fact that these were the rumblings of discontent from the have-nots within the midst of an affluent society." This was why, especially in his later years, as I read him, his work toward, let me try that again. This emphasis on poverty that could affect the lives of people of any color was something that increased in his writings and his speakings later in life. It's also why he could imagine a grand economic plan to help American Blacks, a kind of Marshall Plan, he said, for America's development. But it was one, quote, for all the poor. He believed that the long-term solution was primarily economic, not racial. Point 3. Insofar as critical race theory teaches that we need to do more than simply stop racist discrimination, but must do something positive to change our society and assist Black folks, I think King would agree. He certainly thought that during his own time. It's not enough to avoid sins of commission. We must also not engage in sins of omission. And there is good for all of us to take part in, work which we have a moral obligation to engage. Now, as discussed above, there are structures in place in our society that need to be removed or reformed to create a greater justice. Ignoring these is not acceptable. He wrote, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." And again, a social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. A movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution. King believed that Black folks needed to stop supporting corrupt systems, like segregated busing. He says, "We were simply saying to the white community, we can no longer lend our cooperation to an evil system. From this moment on, I conceived of our movement as an act of massive non-cooperation." He also believed that white people had a role to play. While he unequivocally condemned violence in the streets, he wanted white folks to understand what drives them there. He wrote, "The average white person also has a responsibility. He has to resist the impulse to seize upon the rioter as the exclusive villain. He has to rise up with indignation against his own municipal, state, and national governments to demand that the necessary reforms be instituted, which alone will protect him." Of course, knowing what to dismantle and what to retain is far from easy. And as we will see, dialogue is necessary to determine how best for us to proceed. As for King, we have seen that he believed that the educational system in America needed reworked, but the US Constitution did not. Economic and regulatory changes were also needed when they created systems that perpetuated unjust racial discrimination and poverty. It's also worth pointing out that he believed a new system may require discrimination in favor of Blacks. This is also in keeping with CRT. King wrote, "It is, however, important to understand that giving a man his due may often mean giving him special treatment. A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him in order to equip him to compete on a just and equal basis." This is similar to what Ibram X. Kendi has described, with one important difference, I think. Kendi wrote, "The only remedy to racial discrimination is anti-racist discrimination." You'll notice that Kendi says this is the only remedy, whereas King proposed some discrimination as a possible solution. Number 4, insofar as critical race theory demands fidelity to one position or orthodoxy on matters of race relations, economics, law, or ethics, King would disagree. Unfortunately, CRT often positions itself as the absolute when it comes to discussions of race. There are racists and there are anti-racists. There is no middle ground. You are with me or you are my enemy. And if you disagree with what I have to say, that is only evidence of your defensiveness or your fragility or your blindness or your self-hatred. This idea was expressed rather clearly by Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman from Massachusetts, who positions herself as a CRT advocate. She said, "If you're not prepared to come to the table and represent that voice, don't come, because we don't need any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need black faces that don't want to be a black voice." So apparently, there's only one authentic and acceptable voice that can be brought to the table. This is quite opposed to the principles of Dr. King. In fact, one of the things I've admired most about him is his willingness to engage all ideas critically and fairly. He was the opposite of an ideologue. Much of this probably came from his reading of Hegel, who, and if you know Hegel, then you know that he spoke a great deal about the necessity of bringing together both thesis and antithesis into a conversation. That's how you make progress. That is how you achieve a synthesis of greater understanding. This is the legacy of the best in classical liberalism that we find in King, and why he could explain how I read all of the influential historical thinkers from a dialectical point of view, combining a partial yes and a partial no. Within the Black community, King was part of something that has almost disappeared these days: honest but serious disagreement, discussion, and debate. And that was a good thing. He wrote, "This plea for unity is not a call for uniformity. There must always be healthy debate. There will be inevitable differences of opinion. The dilemma that the Negro confronts is so complex and monumental that its solution will of necessity involve a diversified approach. We need multiple perspectives at the table." Number 5, insofar as critical race theory presents serious critiques of capitalism, I think King would agree. CRT has a reputation for being rather far to the left when it comes to economics. Critiques and even rejections of capitalism, coupled with Marxist analysis of the current political environment, make CRT even more controversial in our national dialogue. I read somewhere, probably on Facebook, that Dr. King was actually a Republican. He wasn't. His political views quite apart from matters of race, were more in keeping with those of Democrats. When it came to economics, he was most decidedly on the left. For various reasons, he was accused of being a communist, and his critiques of capitalism lent themselves to that incorrect conclusion during a time of great political divide. However, as discussed above, King was not an ideologue. He sought to critically engage ideas, seeking where he agreed with them and where he disagreed. He was no Marxist, but he found things of value in Marx. He wrote, again, in short, I read Marx as I read all of the influential historical thinkers from a dialectical point of view, combining a partial yes and a partial no. And he was very clear about what he found to be significant and fundamental. He was very clear about what he found to be significant and fundamental flaws in Marx. At the same time, he had very strong critiques of capitalism. He thought that it communicated corrupt values. He wrote, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. And he placed a fair amount of the blame on capitalism. He believed the solution to the problems of so many Black Americans was addressing poverty in general. And the way to do that was with government programs. In his words, we must not be oblivious to the fact that the larger economic problems confronting the Negro community will only be solved by federal programs involving billions of dollars. One unfortunate thing about Black power is that it gives priority to race precisely at a time when the impact of automation and other forces have made the economic question fundamental for Blacks and whites alike. In this context, a slogan, power for poor people, would be much more appropriate than the slogan, Black power. He was also a fan of universal income. I just recently discovered that myself, reaching the conclusion, I am now convinced that the simplest approach will be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. At the same time, as bears continual repeating, he was no ideologue. He was not a man to be pigeonholed, and he spoke out against government regulations that inhibited small businesses. The insistence on educational certificates and credentials for skilled and semi-skilled jobs is keeping Negroes out of both the private business sector and government employment. Negro exclusion is not the purpose of the insistence upon credentials, but it is its inevitable consequence. Number 6, insofar as critical race theory communicates that Blacks are powerless victims, King would definitely disagree. Now, of course, no one says this, but the subtext is often there. When our conversations and our discourse are dominated by a fixation on race and racism and discrimination and privilege and injustice and inequity and bigotry, when the role of racism, systemic and individual, is presented as the cause of nearly all inequity, when the whole system is rigged, irredeemably, and permanently racist, it is impossible not to draw certain conclusions about how much control you have over your life. Even those who are passionate about improving things can add to the message that Black Americans are weak and lacking in moral agency. Some of you may be familiar with John McWhorter at Columbia University, who has argued that no book has infantilized Blacks more than Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. In the work of CRT founder Derek Bell, so-called progress was only made when whites saw the change to be to their own advantage, what he called interest convergence. This is a rather pessimistic lens through which to view American history. Now, that's not to say that Bell was entirely wrong. People do, for various reasons and in various ways, seek their own self-interest. That is often a significant factor. However, to view every improvement in race relations, from abolition to Brown v. Board of Education to the gains of the civil rights during the 1960s as only interest convergence, this undercuts any belief in progress based on changing people's attitudes for the better. It's a lot harder to motivate people to take their destinies into their own hands to improve our society and nation when they believe others don't ever and won't ever really care about helping them. Add to this the narrative that race relations may have changed, but they haven't really improved, and you render hope nearly non-existent. King, on the other hand, believed in the strength, resilience, determination, responsibility, and dignity of Black men and women. And more than that, he knew that those traits had carried them and would continue to carry them forward in their efforts to improve their own lives as well as the country for their children. As for this pessimism, in his own day, he saw something similar in the Black Power movement and condemned it in no uncertain terms. Beneath all the satisfaction of a gratifying slogan, Black Power was a nihilistic philosophy born out of the conviction that the Negro can't win. It is at bottom the view that American society is so helplessly corrupt and enmeshed in evil that there is no possibility of salvation from within. King wanted Black Americans to believe in themselves. He wrote, "One must not overlook the positive value in calling the Negro to a new sense of manhood, to a deep feeling of racial pride, and to an audacious apprehension of his heritage. The Negro had to be grasped by a new realization of his dignity and worth. He had to stand up amid a system that still oppresses him and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of his own value. He could no longer be ashamed of being Black." As for the permanence and ubiquity of racism, he warned against generalizing about all white people. He said, "I should have been reminded that disappointment produces despair, and despair produces bitterness, and that the one thing certain about bitterness is its blindness. Bitterness has not the capacity to make the distinction between some and all. When some members of the dominant group, particularly those in power, are racist in attitude and practice, bitterness accuses the whole group. We must not create a monolith of white people or whiteness in our minds any more than we should of Black people." And I don't believe that he would have approved of so much current language about whiteness being a form of oppression. Creating a narrative where Blacks are nearly powerless, where their only chance at progress is when their oppressors give them something, is to invite Blacks to believe the worst of what they were told about themselves in our nation's history. King wrote, "The Negro will only be truly free when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own beings and signs with the pen and ink of assertive selfhood his own emancipation proclamation." Now, none of this is to deny the serious challenges that face so many Black Americans. The question is one of attitude. What attitude do you take to these challenges? King was fond of the story of Old Bull, the Norwegian violinist, and King describes the time while giving a concert in Paris, his A string snapped. Instead of stopping, Old Bull transposed the composition and finished the concert on 3 strings. This is what the Negro confronts. Through years of unjust oppression and unmerited suffering, our A strings of opportunity have snapped. But the performance of our lives must go on, and without self-pity or surrender, we must go forward on 3 strings. Number 7. Insofar as critical race theory takes evil seriously, not taking progress for granted, King would definitely agree. The previous point I made should not by any means suggest that Dr. King was unaware of the extent, the brutality, the viciousness of racial discrimination in the United States. His bombed home would have been a certain reminder throughout his entire life. But he knew that his dream was far, before we get to his dream, King recognized the full extent and horrors of the mid-20th century in the South in America. And while we often think of him talking about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice and his "I have a dream" speech, those are true aspects of his personality. But at the same time, he recognized that there was no guarantee of the way that things would go. He wanted people to know we must get rid of the false notion that there is some miraculous quality in the flow of time that inevitably heals all evils. Things are not destined to improve if we wait them out. In 1963, from Birmingham jail, he wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Hard work was needed and is needed to take place if things are going to improve. He continued, "Freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And from that same jail cell, he wrote, "Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God." The evil in human hearts, man's inhumanity to man, this tension at the heart of the universe, It's all real, and King knew it. Naive optimism and gradualism are the enemies of justice. Evil must be taken seriously. Number 8, insofar as critical race theory gives a pass to violence, King would disagree. Now, I should be clear at this point that critical race theory does not encourage violence. And most of the critical race theorists who I've looked at are not promoting violence or rioting or destruction of property. However, the year 2020 saw a great deal of violence in the streets, and many people wondered why there wasn't a clearer rejection of what was happening. King did not simply refrain from violence himself, and he did more than just encourage others to follow his example. He demanded nonviolence as a moral imperative. He wrote, "Over the past few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends." And again, destructive means cannot bring constructive ends because the means represent the ideal in the making and the end in progress. Immoral means cannot bring moral ends, for the ends are pre-existent in the means. When others were engaged in violence, he condemned it. If violence was even perceived to be related to his organization and his work, he immediately distanced himself from it. An unequivocal rejection of violence required more than personal nonviolence. King believed that it must be crystal clear that such an approach to the fight for civil rights must be rejected. He wrote, "On July 24th, officials unleashed force against our peaceful demonstration, brutally beating a pregnant woman and caning one of our lawyers. Some of the Negro onlookers, not our demonstrators, seething with resentment, hurled bottles and stones at the police. At that point, I temporarily halted mass demonstrations, and for several days I visited homes, clubs, and pool rooms, urging that no retaliation be tolerated, and even the angriest of men acceded." And he went so far as to say, "While we are certain that neither the peaceful demonstrators nor persons active in the Albany movement were involved in the violence that erupted last night, we abhor violence so much that when it occurs in the ranks of the Negro community, we assume part of the responsibility for it." Insofar as CRT advocates were fighting for racial justice, but refusing to condemn the violence that was happening around them, I believe that Dr. King would not have been happy with that. Finally, number 9. It is only when critical race theory provides constructive solutions to our problems, when it avoids navel-gazing, that King could get on board. What do we do with our analyses of race relations in America? What do we do with our references to structural racism, to intersectionality, to privilege? Very often, as is the habit with us academics, it makes for very fine conversation or an article to help you get tenure. But is it helping make the world a better place? While King was not speaking of academics here, I believe the sentiment still applies. These men so often have a high blood pressure of words and an anemia of deeds. King was eminently practical. If an idea is only that, something batted about in conversation or on social media, but not leading to concrete proposals and methods of change, of what use is it? This continues to be a challenge for critical race theory, along with the rest of us. How will it move from the faculty lounge to actual improvement of our society? King knew from experience that allusions to problems without real solutions would not lead to necessary change. After the Albany movement, which did not work out as well as he hoped, he wrote, "If I had to do that again, I would guide that community's Negro leadership differently than I did. The mistake I made there was to protest against segregation generally, rather than against a single and distinct facet of it. Our protest was so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left very depressed and in despair. It would have been much better to have concentrated upon integrating the buses or the lunch counters." And so let's leave it at that. Whatever ideas we consider, discuss, debate, and bicker about, let us always be cognizant of the necessity of particular proposals and solutions, and the means to carry them out. Whether one finds critical race theory compelling or problematic, we need to make sure that our feet are on the ground and our hands willing to take up work. As long as we never lose sight of that necessity in our conversations, I think Dr. King would approve. Thank you. So I have, I'm told that there is a working microphone in this aisle. And so if anyone has any questions or comments, critiques, complaints, anything that you would like to ask about or say, I encourage you to step up and let me know your thoughts. If I can give extra credit for that. It's not in the syllabus.
Can you hear me? Yes, no, maybe so. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Are you guys able to hear him? Okay, all right.
Okay,
Please.
bet. So I forget if it was the second or third one that you were talking about. You were talking about King, and I guess it just had me thinking. So are you taking him as like in the last moments from when he died to and just carrying that brought him over? Because I think there have been some evolution in his thought. With some things that have happened in the nation since the 60s. So I just wanted to hear your opinion on that. Like, you think you leave room for evolution of thought of his thought in your process?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So what about the evolution of thought about race relations, both during his lifetime and since the 1960s? So yeah, here's my take on this. During his lifetime, I've tried to get a better handle on how his thought developed and changed throughout his lifetime. My reading of him suggests that you've got some small changes, but for the most part, he really seems pretty consistent to me when I read about the ideas that he taught. There are times near the end of his life that he seems to be getting a little more cynical to me, which I could certainly understand, right? And I've been trying to make sense of that myself. Sometimes he seems to get more cynical, in the later 60s, but he also, I think it was in the later 60s, he predicted that we would have a Black president within 40 years, and he was right. So I think there's some development of his thought, but I think he was pretty consistent throughout his life. Since that time, right, there's this question. I mean, certainly attitudes have changed, right, about race relations and how best to proceed. I do think a lot of our conversations today do find precursors at his time. He and Stokely Carmichael, for example, and Malcolm X, these were people who were very active in the civil rights movements with some very different ideas and got kind of upset with each other at different times. And so I think that some of the views that are being presented today have their precursors during that time. I don't think that they've completely developed since that time. Critical race theory as a legal theory, certainly has a starting point in the 1980s and 90s with Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Delgado. And so, yeah, I think that there you do see a more distinct change. The question then, and this is something for all of us, we should have these conversations. The changes that have taken place since then, or the different views that were represented then and are represented today, which one's the best, right? What's the best way to proceed? I think that we have a tendency to take King and hold him up as the gold standard. Now, I'm a big fan of King. I'll be honest, I'm a big fan of King. Don't agree with him on everything, but I'm a big fan. But we look at him as the gold standard. But okay, if he is the gold standard, well, how does that relate to things? So and I did want to make, I hope this was clear in the presentation. If King disagreed with critical race theory on some point, that doesn't mean King is right and critical race theory is wrong, right? There are places I think King was wrong. And so I didn't want to suggest that this is a critique of critical race theory by a firm gold standard. This is my best effort to take someone who's very important in our history and whose ideas are very important in our history and ask the speculative question, what would he think about what's going on today? So when we look at changes I'm rambling on a little too long here. So let me, when we look at the changes since then, the evolution of thought that you're referring to, I think we need to have conversations. All right, the changes that have happened, are they good? Are they positive? Are they moving in the right direction? And if we all talked about that, we'd probably have a few different opinions. But that's the sort of conversation that I think is good and helpful. I hope that was, yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? How many of the students are thinking, please don't stand up, anyone, because then we get to leave? I know how you think. Okay, well, thank you all. For those who are part of this class, I don't know if I have to thank you, you sort of had to be here. But for the rest of you who showed up on this lousy day, thank you very much for coming out. And if you didn't want to ask a question now, but want to talk with me after we wrap this up, I'd love to talk with you. Otherwise, please be safe out there, especially if you're driving home, and have a good weekend.